Hello and welcome to this Business Day Focus 4.0 digital dialogue in partnership with BCX, Logicalis South Africa and Werksmans attorneys. I'm Alishia Seckam. Well, technology is continually changing and at a rapid pace, but cyber criminals' tools and techniques are evolving just as quickly, and that means maintaining the security of a network and data. Keeping on top of cybersecurity risks is a constant challenge. So, as organizational operations and workplaces become increasingly digital, online security should be ranking high on the list of business considerations. But is it? Over the next hour, we're going to be hearing from a few industry experts as they explore the next big threat to cybersecurity. What kind of investments need to be made to counter that threat, and the implications or consequences if an attack does happen to occur, nevertheless. Now, Wayne Olson, who's Managing Executive of Cybersecurity at BCX, was supposed to have joined us for this morning's conversation, but due to unforeseen circumstances is unable to. As the saying goes, though, the show must go on. So with me in studio, Morné Laubscher, he's Chief Technology Officer at Logicalis South Africa, and Smith, who's Director of Regulatory Practice, Area and Data Privacy, Protection and Cybersecurity Service Line at Werksmans Attorneys. Welcome to you both. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're going to be getting into the conversation in just a bit. Before we do, to our audience, as you listen in, if any questions are triggered for you, pop them into the chat box, live chat. I'll pick them up. I'll pose them to our guests on your behalf towards the end of the session in the final 15 minutes. So we do encourage engagement. Let's get into it, Morné. Cybercrime is set to become the greatest security threat to all organizations. Exaggeration or accurate reflection of reality?
Absolutely accurate reflection. I think if we look at where the digital economy is going and where digital transformation and digitization has taken organizations, more will talk more about data privacy, I'm sure. We have many risks we need to be concerned about, So organizations drive insight, innovation and transformation through better access to our assets. And the challenge is, if your assets are readily available in the ICT sector, they're also at risk. And so as we approach this digital economy, the risk will exponentially increase.
Let's take a look at that rise in a risk, right? There's no denying that the COVID-19 pandemic has forced organizations to digitally sprint. How much of a correlation, Amor, between that and the number of cyber attacks we're seeing?
It's absolutely enormous. And if I can just link on to what Morné has just said. We live in the cloud. We've moved our worlds into the cloud, our secrets, our finances, everything. Our businesses are on the cloud, and we should expect the new criminal to live in this cloud as well. So how do we prepare for this? And as we look at the massive cyber breaches we've experienced just in South Africa, if you look at the TransUnion breach, 54 million South Africa data subjects, individuals, because remember, a data subject equals an individual or company. Data was leaked in terms of that breach. If we look back at the Liberty breach that took place, and just the impact on the markets as well, because we need to realize one thing. This is not something that happens and there's no consequences. The Liberty share price fell 5% based on that breach. And we look at bigger issues, customer trust. How do you trust the entity that's breached lost my data? And all of that has to come together. So as we discuss this and think about solutions and the way forward, it's not only a legal problem, it's not only a tech problem, it's not an HR problem. It's how do we combine all functions within an organization to actually address this massive risk that we are confronted with.
And it's because it's become so entrenched, right, in our daily activities. According to an Interpol report, South Africa experienced 230 million cyber attacks between January 2020 and February 2021 alone. So that is significant. Let's get to grips, Morné, with what the main types of vulnerability in cybersecurity are the current cyber threats we're looking at?
So I think, speaking earlier about digital transformation and the access to data, that is a real threat. For us as an organization, we've got a big focus on data privacy and allowing or enabling organizations to protect their data. We see that for a lot of CIOs, the major focus is how do we protect the crown jewels as such, and make sure that although we're driving insights into this data, it's not available to people with malicious intent. What I also think is important is the individual awareness inside organizations and the general public around data security. Mo and I were having a quick chat earlier in the waiting room about the privacy of the individual, and how the responsibility we have on social media to protect our identity as that first sort of point of contact. So these things are very, very important when looking at cybersecurity. A business can have all the resilience in the world, but if the employees are not educated, that's a massive risk.
I want to refine that a bit more. How important is distinction here? Because not all cyber crimes are the same when we reference the Cyber Crimes Act 19 of 2020. So what's the difference between cyber-enabled crimes and cyber crimes?
Yeah, it's such an important topic because one would think if we talk about cyber fraud that, why can't the common law just deal with it? Why, we've got the National Prosecuting Authority, why don't they just prosecute this? But there's a major, major difference. On the one hand, we've got criminals. If we think about this dating scams, they would email the victim and build up this relationship over email and never be available on camera to actually have a conversation so you can see who the criminal is you're dealing with. That is not a cyber crime. What they use to commit the fraud on that victim happens to be an electronic piece of electronic equipment, but it's just an enablement in terms of having to commit that crime. If we talk about true cyber crime, it's an attack or the misuse of a computer system or electronic infrastructure to commit the crime. So we talk about, something like cyber espionage, cyber terrorism, money laundering, all of these crimes, and then in the South African system, and it's not only South Africa, it's worldwide where this concept is being introduced, malicious communication. And Alishia, this is such an important part of our cybercrime legislation that one shouldn't forget about. The malicious messages that are being sent that entice violence or damage or harm to an individual, the cyberbullying that occurs. All of these aspects are pulled together. And if we look at South Africa and the whole world around us, Africa happens to experience the least targeted in terms of cyber crimes. But, and I think this is a very important but, South Africa, in terms of the global scale, is number 6 on the list for cyber attacks. On the Interpol report, or that's incidents, in the Interpol report, South Africa actually lists number 3 as a victim for cyber crimes. And you might ask why. It's the infrastructure we've built up over decades that actually we're good, and that makes us a victim to the cyber criminals.
So let's take a look at what makes us more susceptible to being the victim here. What are the well-known or the common weaknesses that sit in digital workspaces that allow for easy infiltration, Morné?
So I think what's really important is now that post-pandemic, a lot of organizations have adopted a remote working strategy. There's a lot that needs to be considered. During the crisis, basic things were focused on like remote working, telecommunication, video conferencing. But there's a lot that needs to be considered. We now have data in transit, so if your employee is working on his workspace remotely and he's accessing relevant information or sensitive data, thinking papier, access to confidential information, these things all need to be considered. How do you securely extend the workplace into the home office? and what do you deploy from a resilience or measure perspective to ensure that you're managing that adequately. So now that we post-pandemic and we're busy returning to normal, we need to think about this new way of working that the world's adopted and how we better manage that to manage risk.
We'll be getting to solutions in just a bit. Before I do, we've got a very active audience joining us this morning, and a question that has popped in: is it worth having a secure VPN connection? How secure is secure?
So I think ultimately the short answer is yes. There are many technologies now that are much better suited to drive security. It also depends on your organization's technology strategy and your adoption of cloud and whether you've got a hybrid architecture. So, I think the general premise is that a secure VPN is absolutely required. But these days with SD-WAN technologies and modern cloud technologies, if you've got a cloud strategy and you've deployed those cloud technologies adequately, the requirement for these VPNs are removed.
Amor, the World Economic Forum's 2020 Global Risk Report states that the rate of detection or prosecution is as low as 0.05% in the US. And so no surprise I get it right, because there's just no adequate reining in of the problem here. I use that US stat, but it's safe to say that this is a worldwide phenomenon. Why is that the case if this is such a high stakes game?
If we look at, and I'd like to answer your question as follows. If we look at the risk, it's estimated that by 2025, the value of cybercrime would be $10.8 trillion US. That's the amount that we're looking at, that we will reach in 2025, which is in just around the corner in 3 years' time from where we're sitting now. And we need to remember one thing. Technology develops, legislation develops, solutions develops, but the cyber criminals are running at such a fast pace, because we are not talking about people that don't understand technology. We are talking about technology savvy criminals targeting networks. So the battle to keep up in terms of developing cyber solutions, security solutions and legislation is almost always a step behind what is happening. And this is a problem worldwide. And now we need to understand one thing as well. People are adopting using the internet and internet solutions and app solutions at an enormous pace. We've moved away from brick and mortar.
Yeah.
Our economy also moved into a digital era. So if our president talks about the fourth industrial revolution, in a sense, we're already in the fifth industrial revolution internationally. So as South Africans, and if we look at South Africa being the biggest victim of cyber crime and attacks, it's estimated that we are experiencing 544 attacks per minute in South Africa. Now, we need to look at these aspects and consider it and think, how do we prepare for a cyber attack, and how do we protect ourselves? So, it is not, we're not living in the 1600s where it's easy and you can see the problem arise across the horizon and you can prepare for it. These things happen in milliseconds, and that's what we need to prepare ourselves for.
So
there's a great example, I'll segue on the IoT side, which is quite interesting, is that, so traditionally organizations ran their operational technologies, their OT networks and their IT networks separately. But as we evolve digitally, these systems are merging.
Yeah.
The challenge this is creating is that they're easily accessible now to cyber criminals. And so there's a responsibility and a new requirement which we need to target in the IoT space to protect these systems. There's a very good example. A waterworks in Florida was targeted a while back. And the system that managed the chemicals to purify the water was targeted by a cyber criminal with the intent of changing the chemical mixture to make the water poisonous. And this is a use case out there that's documented with, luckily they were able to prevent this, but just an example of this OT-IT convergence in IoT that we face that we need to protect.
And I think what we want, you want your fridge to tell you the milk is about to run out, because you don't want to leave the office at 8 tonight and then arrive home and someone stares at you and says, but didn't you buy milk? So we are hunger. There's a hunger, inherent hunger for technology. And then at the same time, what is reasonable in the solutions that we are putting forward?
Yeah. And yet, I read an article in Security Magazine about a week ago, highlighting that while executives claim cybersecurity is a high priority, the average spend on cybersecurity is 0.5% of company revenue. I'm not sure if that's a global stat or it pertains to a specific region, because no mention was made. But how do you explain a disconnect like that, Morné, between what the execs are saying on the one hand and what budgets are actually reflecting?
I think the rapid rate of technology advancement is the challenge here. You know, it used to be that in a traditional ecosystem, we'd have big monolithic infrastructures that cost hundreds of millions. Big enterprise businesses had 3 to 5 year cycles that they planned for. Now we see a rapid rate. You know, hyperscalers, they launch new features and new technologies almost on a monthly basis. I think the accepted industry sort of turnaround now is about 6 months, you know, and a lot of the stuff we talk about and some of the other talks we've had in the past is about being able to pivot your business to adopt these technologies quicker and faster. The problem is you now have a responsibility to understand how you do that in a secure manner. So, you know, I think it's less a case of organizations not realizing the urgency of the matter and more a case of the evolution is really caught up. But we need to level set now and educate the market and work on how we come together as business leaders to fight this crisis and definitely try and affect that budget shift.
Well, we've got Morné saying you now have the responsibility. From a legal perspective, where does the responsibility for combating risk within the organization actually lie?
I'd like to answer that question, but I first want to just link to what Morné has just said. If we look at the data privacy legislation, not only in South Africa, in fact globally, and in Europe specifically the GDPR, that's the leading piece of legislation. The requirement or the expectation, if we look at security of data, which links to cybersecurity, because this is what we're talking about to the most extent, is what is reasonable for the size of the organization and the amount of personal data that you actually control. So if we look at that statistic that you just reflected, you know, you need to ask yourself, to what extent will the enforcer of data privacy legislation look at an organization and say, but did you actually take the reasonable steps to protect the personal information under your control and that you hold? And not only that, it's also a question from a data subject perspective. Did you take the reasonable steps required to protect my personal information? And at the end of the day, it does come down to what technologies or protective measures have we implemented. So that's a very important aspect, to realize that you've got this responsibility. And you know, you might say, what is reasonable? But there is tests legally in you know, that our courts have over years ruled on what is deemed as a reasonable and the reasonability test. So that on the one hand, and then we look at the organization and we need to ask ourselves, but where does this responsibility lie? And I can't, but if I look at listed companies, think, but number one, this is a responsibility of the board. What is that responsibility in terms of your risk committee? And where does the risk of cyber and protecting data and privacy lie on the risk log? How have you dealt with it, and what reasonable measures and procedures and governance structure have you put in place to mitigate against the risk? Because this is not a situation of, oh, do something because you can be fined, or do something. That's not the way, in my view, how one ought to consider this. The question is, how do we mitigate not to get there? How do we mitigate to protect the data? Because data is enormously valuable. that is indeed, as the saying goes, the new gold and the new oil of the economy.
Absolutely. But it begs the question then, what Amor is highlighting, do leaders know how to define the risk profile of an organization, Morné?
It definitely is top of mind. We do a survey every year in our customer base, a CIO survey. The latest one, we surveyed 1,000 CIOs and we asked them what is top of mind for them and you know, what's your KPI so we can assist. And the first one was digital and you know, driving digital adoption and pivoting your business post-pandemic versus how quickly others have. But the very second one is then the anxiety around data privacy, and now that you've got these systems and you have readily access to this data, how do you protect this data and what's our responsibility? So we are seeing it out there. Organizations definitely have it top of mind. It is on the CIO's docket, and that's good to know.
How do you manage data though? I mean, what does data management entail? Because, you know, people almost want a step-by-step guide to getting this right. And a question that has popped up, what's the best methodology to mitigate this huge threat? Because it seems like just a lot to take on at the same time, and you want a process to follow.
So again, I think, you know, it depends on the technologies you've adopted inside your organization. You need to look at every facet of your ICT, you know, estate and the systems and the solutions that you've got deployed inside your organization. If I can use a very basic analogy, you know, normal systems that back up data and store, protect data, basically replicate the problem, because that's how the technologies were designed. So if you face a ransomware attack and your data is encrypted, if you don't have the right technologies in place, like air gapping, for instance, which means that you can go back in time on the data that you're protecting, you're actually also storing the problem. And so what happens is cyber criminals infiltrate organizations hundreds of days before they strike. And they plan very meticulously and make sure that they get the right data sources, and that it's data sources that's important to you, especially when they want to hold you ransom. So if you don't have systems and technologies and services that plans for this eventuality, that gives you the ability to go back in time on various levels of systems inside your organization, you're at risk.
Morné is talking about technology, he's talking about systems. Amor, do we as a country have the necessary skills in place to use the systems, the technology effectively enough?
You know, the sad answer is no. There's an absolute skills gap. And together with that skills gap, we've got a further problem. Because if we look at this whole compliance governance structure from a regulatory perspective, we've got all the tools that we implement, and the CTO and his team do their best. But then we need to pull the rest of the organization across this line as well, in terms of business processes and policies. And then you get people that want to write and present to you 30-page policies. Alishia, no one reads a 30-page policy. People want it in a form that they can actually digest it quickly and understand what this means. So the whole issue around what is the change management process that we implement to pull all of these aspects together, to a certain extent alleviates some of the pressure. But do we have a problem? Yes, we do have a problem. And you know, we've seen it in the UK, for instance, and I might say Rwanda has now also rolled out a program like that. And this mid-level of people not going to university to study degrees in BSc, IT technology, or whatever degree might they be, or engineering in terms of technology, but almost a diploma type of qualification focusing on cyber security and cyber skills to fill that gap. So we need to ask ourselves, where are we thinking, where are we aiming towards in terms of filling this gap in the South African society? And it's an important question, taking into consideration our enormously high level of unemployment. And we've got a lot of very bright young people desperate for jobs. So how do we upskill them to actually, to an extent, fill this gap that we've got.
Absolutely.
I also think, you know, to your point, that this is much more than just an IT function. The CISOs, the CIOs, the CTOs.
I was just going to ask
Yeah.
you,
Yes.
know, how much of an evolution have
Yeah.
we seen in the CISO, the Chief Information Security
Security
Officer's role?
Yeah.
Have we seen over the years?
Yeah. So I think, you know, historically, IT and IT-related functions it was a grudge purchase. You know, something that, to your point earlier on, the percentages organizations wasn't paying a lot of attention to. The roles of CISOs, CTOs, CIOs have definitely changed, and it is now a case of they need a seat at the table, they need executive alignment, they need to be able to have a mandate from the C-suite of the organization to drive and affect change and collaborate with legal and governance in order to make sure that we are making the right responsible decisions for our organizations, to your point.
Morné, is it a hard sell though? Getting this extended C-suite, you know, to understand the risks in financial terms and actually make clear decisions about the business's priorities? Or are there steps that a CISO can take in this process to weave security into every part of the business conversation?
Yeah. So we're definitely seeing a shift in the market. I think organizations have realized in the enterprise space, certainly, that this is a massive priority. There are forums now for CISOs to affect change and drive awareness. And this speaks to, you know, whether security is an IT-related function or not. And the reality is it's not. You know, although cyber specialists and CISOs do engage with the IT sector most of the time in order to affect change, the cyber resilience and security responsibility of a business goes way beyond the IT function. You know, it's about, it's a very analytical function, understanding the risks out there, understanding the governance implications, understanding how we guard our organizations against those threats.
Amor, I know that we try to get away from red tape as much as possible, right? But do you see this eventually becoming a fiduciary responsibility for business leaders, you know, a fiduciary priority?
It ought to be. And especially, you know, we're singing of the same hymn sheet to this morning, but it ought to be. And the reality for me lies in the following. You know, privacy is a constitutional guaranteed right that we have in South Africa, a very precious right that we ought to celebrate as South Africans. So we've got a constitutionally protected right to privacy, and that privacy is valuable, and it's valuable in terms of the data and the data sets that we collate. And then we've got specific industries that are enormously data rich in order to function and operate. You know, our financial sector, the insurance, mobile network, you know, our IT infrastructure sectors, sits on the retail, enormous data sets. And it's important for them to be able to use machine learning and artificial intelligence to interpret and analyze that data, to create and innovate new products.
Yeah.
So if we want to grow and if we want to actually excel going forward, we need to understand the data, but at the core, we need to protect the data. And that is a fiduciary duty in my mind, to protect that data. Also in line with the obligation in terms of that the Constitution inherently places on everyone to protect privacy.
Because this is not a one-off that we're looking at, and something like a regulation saying you must makes it mandatory, right, for companies to comply on an annual basis. But if we consider, Morné, that it's small and medium businesses that are the top target for cyber attacks, because they are unlike you know, big corporations that actually have the capacity, the budget to reinforce their ring fences. How do you make that make sense for a small business? Because the main question they ask is, you know, are we not adding unnecessary complexity and cost onto their books?
Absolutely. So I think, traditionally speaking earlier about these traditional systems that took years and the adoption of technology and cloud, and how cloud providers have democratized access to innovative solutions like artificial intelligence and various other things, it is well possible. So it used to be that these very expensive systems were only possible in big enterprises that had hundreds of millions to spend on the analytics engines and the systems required to fight cybercrime and protect data and drive analytics. But the hyperscalers have made all of these systems a consumption-based service now. So they've invested in these platforms, and we can consume and enjoy the benefits of these platforms. So many organizations like Logicalis and BCX have network operation centers and security operation centers that have specialists and analysts that know how to apply this technology to protect your organization as a service. So now a small to medium enterprise does not need to have hundreds of millions to enjoy the ease of mind or security that these systems provide, because they are a consumption-based service.
That in part answers a viewer question. How can you protect your business if you aren't a cybersecurity expert? No one's asking you to be. You bring in the experts that
Correct.
you need. Are there cost-efficient ways, though, Morné, for organizations to step up their defenses against cybercrimes?
Absolutely. I think education is critical. There are platforms out there like KnowBe4 that allows you to educate your staff at a very cost-effective rate. We were talking earlier about the individual identity, and especially smaller organizations, big enterprises do educate their workforce around ICT and the security threat in the cyber side, where mid-market organizations might not have that focus. Again, there's platforms that you can adopt in a consumption-based manner to drive the awareness in your organization. So that would be a recommendation, because that removes that risk. The individual is the target from a social engineering perspective.
Amor, how much value do you attach to the importance of training your employees on security best practices at the end of the day in order to reduce the cyber risks that is just so prevalent?
Well, they're the proverbial firewall, aren't they? It is absolutely important.
You say proverbial firewall. I've got a statement here. Your employees are the weakest link in your cybersecurity chain.
Which is absolutely true. They are the weakest link, and they ought to be empowered to be that firewall. And if I, talking about training, and we've developed e-learning, and I always think about e-learning as the absolute way to train employees, because they have to listen to something and they have to click through something and read something, and they can't sit in a auditorium on their mobile and actually read messages on some other app. So it's so important to train them. And it's simple ways of training as well. I like rolling out a pamphlet campaign where you make it interesting, and you need their attention and draw their attention to the issues. Because phishing is one of the most core issues when it comes to cybercrime, to actually prepare and educate your employees on. What does it mean? What does a phishing attack mean? What does it look like? How many times do you experience it? And how do you roll out these tests to actually demonstrate within your own organization how people just so easily fall for phishing attacks? We talk about whales and all these different kinds of phishing attacks that you get. But these urgent messages or email or SMS to say, urgently pay this invoice, and you think it might be the chairman or the CEO, it's not. Focus on what that email addy actually says. Is it the sender, a true sender? And people are gullible. And on various levels. It's not within your organization, from the chairman's office to the lowest level. People are gullible, and they are your risk. So educating them, empowering them, in the first instance, protect yourself. If we look at where cyber attacks originate from, and whether it's outside attacks or whether it's malicious attacks, roughly 28% of security breaches in itself results within your own, that your employees are responsible for that. So educating them becomes vital. Obviously, you can't educate against a disgruntled employee.
Absolutely.
But you can educate.
You can educate the fact that cybersecurity goes beyond having just a strong password.
Indeed.
Right? So, Morné, what's the saying? Culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So how successful have you been when it comes to encouraging and fostering a good cyber hygiene? I think that's what they call it these days. Because cybersecurity is more often than not considered an IT job, and there's a mindset shift. There's a cultural shift that needs to happen.
I think we've been quite successful with customers and inside our organization. It definitely starts with the education of staff, like we've been saying the whole day this morning, or the whole segment this morning. But from a cyber awareness perspective, our organization has tremendous focus on this. So, we recently had a very basic feature we rolled out at a customer that protected their workspace environment. They had a major problem with passwords, so just to give you an idea, people write down basic passwords, they're all over the place, and it's quite easy to use that if you walk past their desk or whatever the case may be. We changed that whole system to a QR code system. We had a campaign, flyer campaign, staff are able to use their mobile phones to securely multi-authenticate. These are the things you need to drive to adopt, the right measures in order to drive that resilience. And I think we've had good success.
And that brings us to repercussions, right? So, when working at a company, can an employee be held responsible for exposing the company to an attack, even if they've not been informed or trained in cybersecurity practices?
That's a very interesting question from that viewer, because it pulls into a certain extent a bit of labor law into the discussion here where we live in the cyber world this morning. And, if we look at the responsibility from a labor law perspective, there is an obligation on training employees and educating them when you want to hold them responsible for not abiding by certain rules or legislative requirements. So that duty of companies to actually train their employees becomes a bigger responsibility also when they want to turn around and face the employee and say, but this is the individual that caused the problem and we're now going to get rid of him. So that might just land you up before the labor courts for an unfair dismissal in terms of the process. So there's an obligation. If you want to hold employees responsible to your policies and your procedures, you need to educate them on that.
So, how does an organization ensure that its remote workforce model doesn't now compromise the business by managing network security and data from any place at any time? Because this is now what adds a whole another level of complexity to the equation.
We started off this morning and you asked the question about VPNs.
Yeah.
And I think if we look back when COVID emerged and everyone ran home and had to work from home, that was one of the biggest issues we were confronted with in South Africa, with the insecurity around VPNs, and then clever people put forward solutions around that, double authentication, encryption, all things that employees absolutely hate, because naturally, people don't like changes being introduced. They don't want a new policy because they think it's an obligation. They don't want new training to be rolled out because they think this is going to impact on my work. So all of these aspects must be pulled together, Alishia, to try and mitigate that risk. We are not going to move back to a world where everyone will be at the office all the time. We need to accept that we've got remote working, but your whole compliance regulatory environment must actually cater for this and must be communicated to your employees, from policies or systems that you implement to training that you roll out and to that change management, which is uncomfortable, but it is necessary to have that, to implement that.
We've really gone through all the facets that an organization and business leaders need to pay attention to, Morné. Is there a yardstick? How do you know that you've reached optimal levels of cybersecurity?
So one can procure services to test your resilience. Again, as a service, so it doesn't need to be a very expensive exercise, necessarily employing the specialists. So there's penetration testing services in the market that you can procure. Once you feel you are ready to say, let's test and see where we are and give us a score on a maturity matrix to say, you're adequately protected, or these are the areas in your organization you need to look at. Many organizations now have adopted a model of doing this quarterly. So they continually measure the environment that they're managing to try and improve on what they have.
I've got to ask you though, is innovation happening faster than cybersecurity capabilities are evolving?
I think skills, specifically in our market in South Africa, is a big problem. Across the security space, the cloud space, there's amazing technologies out there. But educating the masses and creating opportunity for people for employment, to Amore's point earlier, is how we're going to win this war, for lack of a better word, because we have to absolutely get more specialists in the market. We definitely have academies that we run as well at Logicalis, and we bring on young school leavers to teach them. And I think more organizations should adopt that strategy. There is not enough skills in the market.
Try as you might to win the war, sometimes you've got to acknowledge that you lose the war. So how do you make sure you've got a good enough disaster recovery plan in place to enable that business continuity is, progresses following a cyber attack, even if it does occur?
Right. So there's two ways of looking at that, at the risk of getting too technical. We've got disaster recovery is the ability for your business and all its systems to immediately get replaced by an exact duplicate somewhere. And then you've got data management and backup solutions, which is two separate ways of looking at the problem. If your disaster recovery solution is readily available, you effectively replicate the problem, which is a challenge when we're looking at ransomware and various other things. With the right data management strategy, you can back up points in time and use this technology called air gapping, so that when there's an event, what you're storing does not translate, or the problem does not affect what you've stored over time. And then you can go back in time up to 100 plus days, depending on what your policies say you should and how you want to configure that. So those services are available. I think the risk is just having the focus on disaster recovery or DR as a solution, and then actually replicating that problem and not understanding that you've over-engineered, and you should just look at whether you can go back in time and whether you've got that air gap between the reality and the current status and what you're storing over time to recover from.
Last year we had President Cyril Ramaphosa sign the Cyber Crimes Bill, right? And that looks to bring South Africa's cybersecurity laws in line with the rest of the world. How far apart are we at this point?
I think we're far apart in terms of what that piece of legislation requires government to do as well. If we look at the security hub and the what we need to implement, and government, what the structures they have to implement. And thereby, I don't intend to be overcritical. We shouldn't think that there are zero skills in South Africa. There are skills, and there are actually exceptionally well-skilled individuals, also in the police service, that understand cybercrime. The problem is the group of those individuals. They're very small. There are very few of those individuals. And that is the problem. And, if we look at the amount of attacks and the size of the problem, the handful of individuals can't deal with it. And then how do we actually pull this through in terms of the sanctions that the legislation provides for? If I say we need to marry the data privacy legislation and the Cyber Crimes Act, and you can't look at it in isolation, we see the information regulator acting stronger and stronger and growing from strength to strength. But the implications and the POPI legislation, the sanction that it provides for, to be frank, is is dismal. It's
and
a
that's
10 million
exactly what I was
rand fine.
Yeah.
It doesn't really mean anything. So we need to attach the cyber legislation with the true, you can go to jail, and this is a criminal offence sanction to it, and marry those processes. Now, in a country where we sit with the NPA under such enormous pressure, we need to realize, in the interest of growth of the economy, how important it is to actually prosecute the cyber criminals. But more importantly, and I think this is the thing we need to realize, cyber criminals operate in a global world. So we look at a global legal world that we actually need to investigate and pull together resources in terms of investigating and taking action against cyber criminals. And there are a lot of developments in that arena, which I believe we can be positive about. Resources coming in internationally into South Africa to educate, to uplift, and working together. So I think we can see that we'll see an immediate effect and impact, more from a global cooperation perspective, and then later on, hopefully a quicker response in terms of just the South African society and societal problems.
Okay, so that influencing then where your confidence levels are sitting when it comes to South Africans being able to enforce cybersecurity laws at the end of the day, right? I'm going to hit pause on the conversation for now and open up to filtering in some of the questions that have been coming through from our viewers this morning. Of course, I've been filtering through some of them through as the conversations progressed. I want to issue a quick reminder to those of you watching. This is your opportunity to post any questions the conversation up to this point has triggered for you onto the chat box. I'll pick them up on my end and pose it to the relevant speaker on your behalf. So, Morné, what would an organization's suggested first response be when faced with a cyber or ransom attack? And I guess it's also significant to highlight whether ransomware is still a big threat in the current environment.
So ransomware is certainly a big threat in the current environment. Let me answer the last part of that question first. So I think, we spoke earlier about what we see in news and big organizations that's been mentioned. And unfortunately, only the high-profile organizations do, appear in the media. And so we don't see frequent reporting on ransomware. But the sad reality is that ransomware is very real. Many organizations, smaller organizations, are targeted and, experience this threat, on a daily basis. And unfortunately, because these organizations are smaller, to get that organization to grind to a complete halt with ransomware is quite easy. And so the net effect is we have many organizations that continually pay these ransoms and nobody's aware. And so because it's such a lucrative engagement for these syndicates, they're constantly reinventing how they go about engineering these attacks. It is a very real threat and something we really need to be cognizant of and protect against.
Yeah. First response if an attack does occur or if you're faced with that ransom attack?
So forensic services, understanding from a cyber forensic perspective the impact to your organization. So like everything else we've discussed today, there are organizations that provide services from a forensic auditors and investigation perspective. It is very difficult in this day and age with these, massive amounts of technologies that's so easily accessible from cloud providers and alike to really understand the impact to your business. So hit pause. The recommendation is get a forensic auditor on board, understand what has happened from a data custody perspective, from an impact perspective, and then plan your next move on how you're going to mitigate and fix.
I'm going to get to you, Amor, in just a bit. Before I do, Amor talked about earlier us living in the cloud. This is our new reality, and we've taken criminals along for the ride as well. What are the big cloud risks as they stand right now? And do companies have effective enough cloud strategies in play?
So I think I'm going to start by answering that question and saying that cloud is not a risk, it's an enabler. Certainly, all the digital transformation we've spoken about, the heading towards the fifth industrial revolution, the financial economy where it is and where things are headed. This is all thanks to hyperscaler technologies that are readily accessible and that's been democratized fairly successfully. So the technologies themselves, and there are thousands of them in rapid rate of growth and what's possible, enable transformation. However, the skills to responsibly deploy and configure those solutions in a secure manner is finite, like we said before. And that is the risk in cloud. So I think about 78% of cloud breaches is purely because of misconfiguration. The fact that the user of the technology did not understand what was possible. And so it's important that when you adopt cloud, you do it in a responsible manner and you have the right skills to configure what you're doing.
I am a lawyer, so can I just add the following to that at the end of the day? I do believe some of the problems from a cloud perspective also arises because the clients don't properly read the contracts and the agreements. They don't understand what they are buying. And some of the breaches that my team and I have dealt with, the clients would say, but we in the cloud, we've got all this security.
Yeah.
But the cloud, that service provider allows for different levels of security. So understanding what you're actually contracting for becomes very important in that whole discussion and the agreement that you're entering to interpret that. So that's a vital core aspect that businesses should realize, that it's not a one-size-fits-all. There's not one big cloud and we all fit magically into this cloud. It is what are we willing to pay for? How do we deem what's the size of the risk we try to mitigate? And what protections are we actually activating? And if we don't have this business continuity plan in place, paying ransomware never, or that ransom demand, never guarantees that you will get your data back. That is a massive risk. So people are very quick to think we'll just pay the ransom.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the day, that cyber criminal still holds on to that data set. And there's nothing preventing him from actually on-selling that data on the dark web, even after you've paid the ransom.
So what a segue to a question here.
Yeah.
Should we have a better system to prosecute cyber criminals?
There isn't, if we look at our legislation, the legislation is absolutely world-class, first-class, robust piece of legislation. So we can't say from a legislative perspective that the South African legislation is falling short. We've got a proper piece of legislation. What we need is the proper enforcement of that legislation. So the framework is there from a legislative perspective. We need to enforce it.
Let's point to education. Morné, this is a long question, and bear with me. It's important to educate the general population about this as well. It's not only businesses and organizations that should always be aware. Individuals need to be aware for both work, but themselves as well. How do we educate the general population about cybersecurity and its importance? And how do we educate those, and I think this is the important part of the question here, those who have low computer literacy skills or have just started using technology, like children?
That is a very, very good question. So I think if you look at what technology providers are busy doing, they're weaving security into the fundamentals of education and the programs that individuals can join in order to upskill themselves. So one of our partners I recently spoke to about starting another academy, and what was interesting to me is the field we were contracting for had nothing to do with cybersecurity, but the foundational elements of these individuals now entering the ICT sector and being educated was security awareness, and so on. From a minor perspective, that is obviously a big moot point for all of us as parents, especially when you've got younger children. I think educating minors on security is a tough task. there are technologies out there that allow you as a parent to control what it is your minor has access to. I really speak to parents often, and I'm astounded sometimes by what children are able to access or do on mobile devices or tablets. So we've got responsibilities there as well for younger people to ensure that we put the guardrails in place, on these digital platforms and these social platforms to protect them against what's out there. And I think that's not always a focus.
And it's so important, Mo, because it speaks to what you were highlighting, the fact that we don't always know what we're buying into in many instances, and that applying more so to those who aren't computer computer literate, right?
Or savvy.
That's
word.
The word.
So if we consider this, and again, we can learn from the rest of the world. We don't live on an island. We've got the big canvas of the globe out there to consider and learn from. And in this instance, the UK happens to be an excellent example, having rolled out security or cyber training on school level. And if we think about that, and we need to adopt also all educational institutions, and from primary school up, think about privacy, and adopt privacy policies and privacy structures, because remember, the privacy legislation applies to schools as well, and where children are being provided with tablets to do their work on. Part and parcel of that ought to surely be a level of focus on security training. So I do believe there is a requirement and a need for that to be incorporated as we allow our children to start making use of electronic equipment and devices at schools, to actually educate them on the risk of cybercrime as well. And it is a vital problem, because if we look at the privacy of children and cybersecurity of children online, globally, it's a massive problem, and we cannot ignore it. And therefore, when I referred earlier to our privacy legislation talking about that malicious communication, the concept of revenge porn that's weaved into our cyber crime legislation, sending images, electronic images over devices, this is such a core aspect, just to raise with children as well and educating them on that level. So it highlights what the viewer is asking, actually opens up a Pandora's box of concern that we need to focus on. And in my view, it's easy to educate organizations. It's far more difficult to think about how do you talk and how do you get the message across on a level of a grade 1 child or a grade 3 child, and how do we communicate with those individuals. Our information regulator, Advocate Pansy Klakula, she always talks about plain language and speaking to people in a language that we all can understand. We so love to live in our ivory towers and pull out phrases and acronyms, but just talk to everyone as if you're explaining this to your mother.
Absolutely.
And explain it to your daughters so they can understand what the risks are.
Absolutely. Well, I'm very cognizant of time. We don't have many minutes left, just a couple, but I've got to squeeze this question in, Morné. Does load shedding make us more vulnerable to cyber attacks?
That's an interesting one. So I think the short answer is yes. Organizations do need to be cognizant of their architectures and systems, and whether they guard against security threats with load shedding. There's a massive drive in the market around zero carbon, energy solutions, and being able to actually get your organization to run despite load shedding, and the resilience of load shedding. And these solutions, again, does not need to be costly. So, I would recommend that organizations definitely consider, countermeasures for load shedding rather than accepting that there might be a risk.
Absolutely. Well, With that, the hour is up. We've come to the end of this morning's session. It's been such a pleasure chatting to you both, Amor and Morné. So thanks so much for your time, for sharing your perspectives, your insights, your knowledge with us this morning. To our viewers as well, thank you for watching. Thanks so much for engaging with us. That's what builds a conversation like this. And just bear in mind, the conversation has been recorded. The link will be shared with you after this event as well. So keep an eye out for that. And of course, a special thank you to our partners, BCX, Logicalis South Africa, and Werksmans attorneys. For now, from me, Alishia Seckam, it's bye for now.